Hey everyone, welcome to the Mobile User Acquisition Show. In the Mobile User Acquisition Show, we talk about how to use mobile user acquisition strategies to grow your app quickly and capital efficiently. The Mobile User Acquisition Show is presented by me, Shamant Rao, mobile growth leader and founder and CEO of the mobile growth consulting firm Rocketship HQ. Each episode includes strategies, tips, and pointers from the leading edge of mobile user acquisition that you can use to unlock tremendous growth for your app in a sustainable and capital efficient manner.
Our guest today is Nebojsa Radovic, growth lead for the N3twork Scale Platform at N3twork. I'm thrilled to have Nebo, as he is known, because I've known him for many, many years, and he's one of the smartest folks in UA and growth. Nebo talks not just about UA, but also about the extended ecosystem in which it can be the most effective. We explore how collaboration with product, design, and analytics teams can unlock tremendous performance in UA teams and produce hit games.
I'm very excited to welcome Nebojsa Radovic to the Mobile User Acquisition Show. We'll call you Nebo. Nebo, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. I've been following the show for a while now, and you're doing some great stuff for the UA community, so thanks for that.
Absolutely, man. Yeah, and definitely I'm very thrilled to have you because you've been very highly recommended. And as I was saying just before we hit record, you and I have actually moved in similar circles for a long time. We've worked in UA. We've crossed paths for many years, since many years now, and certainly I've heard only very, very good things about all of the work you've done.
Yeah, I thought about it as well. I mean, I'm pretty sure we met when you were still at Bash Gaming, if that was the name of the company, like where you Bingo Bash.
Yeah.
That was a long time ago, and I remember.
2013,
like
I think.
Yeah.
2013, which is crazy dog's years and internet time for sure.
Yeah, I remember coming to your office and we had like complimentary audiences like Bingo Bash in top 11 at the time and meeting with Vikas and you guys. It was a long time ago. And we're still here, alive and kicking.
Yeah. Doing very similar things. So all very exciting. And of course, we're going to talk about some of the ways in which UA has changed and evolved, and your work and my work has changed and evolved since then. And specifically, I think we're going to talk about how there's so much more of an interdependence between product and user acquisition as compared to even a couple of years ago. This is certainly something you've been much more at the forefront of because you work much more closely with game teams with what you do, right? And I'm curious how you first started to think about this interdependence. What were some of the factors that inspired you to start thinking about how critical this interdependence needs to be for the success of a game?
Yeah, I think I was fortunate enough to join N3twork, which at the time was still a small team. I was maybe employee number 30, 35, something like that. So the Legendary, it was a one game company. Like Legendary was the only kind of game that was making money at the time. And because it was a small team and a small company, I had a chance to sit and work with on a daily basis with the game team. And that was the setup that was there even before me. And the people who were running the game were always kind of sitting with the UA people and trying to understand how to unlock growth opportunities. So I joined April 2017. We just raised, I believe, almost like $40 million at the time, and we had to scale that game like really aggressively. And the goal was to scale in the smartest way possible. And because Legendary's monetization is event-driven, actually how events perform and how the game performs has a pretty significant impact on UA performance and more specifically on payback windows. So we wanted to keep the payback windows and to pay the money back in under like 120 and like later 180 days. And to be able to do that, the UA team really had to understand how the game performs. And over time, we realized, okay, it's not just about understanding, it's also about like unlocking growth opportunities and working with the game team to make changes that will potentially help us lower the cost, shorten the payback window, and improve ROAS. So that's how it all started. And you know, over time, we just managed to improve that relationship and do pretty well.
Yeah, and I find that in smaller studios, that relationship can be much more easy to develop, right? Because again, you guys are oftentimes sitting in the same room, and much like you pointed out. But again, I've also seen smaller studios where there still is a silo. So by no means is that taken for granted.
Yeah.
So, you know, with that interdependence in place, what are some of the ways in which a UA team can impact product roadmaps in a way that can contribute to the overall growth of the game itself?
Yeah, I'll share part of my article. I'll just like explain part of the article that explains about like, you know, what the top grossing list looks like right now compared to 4 years ago. And if you look at the top grossing on iTunes 4 years ago, you'll see a lot of mid-core games. And then all the changes that happened on the UA front made promoting mid-core games much harder in the last 4 years, and that's why kind of casual is winning. And all you see nowadays are ads for, you know, like Players games or like Toon Blast, Toy Blast games that are significantly more casual. And this was somewhat, this was somewhat kind of inspired, or this is a byproduct of Facebook and Google moving to like different types of buying. And then when you work closely with the game team and see that something's not working and it's really hard to promote like a particular type of game, then both those two teams can work together to kind of either change the appeal of the game, improve onboarding, or go even deeper and build games that do really well on certain type of traffic or certain type of monetization. I'll just give you a few examples. You know, if suddenly like CPMs on the ad monetization front are much higher, maybe we should show more ads in the game. Or if you know, like we can drive really cheap installs on SDK networks or ad networks, rewarded video networks, whatever you call them, maybe we should improve the onboarding and make the game, you know, more accessible to larger audiences, or improve the retention of users coming from those channels to like because it's just better for it's just better from like an ROAS or payback window standpoint. And the goal it starts from the very kind of high level. The goal is just to unlock growth opportunities. And you know, if these two teams have a common goal, which is grow the revenue of the company, then they also have to work together on finding and unlocking those opportunities. And examples I mentioned are some of the ways how you can do that. So if you look at some of the recent examples of games where like game teams and UA teams work together, in the article I mentioned like Players and Players games where they implement ads inside the game in order to minimize the friction and improve the retention as a result of that. And when I say the friction, I'm thinking I'm talking about the friction between the ad and the onboarding. The other example I use is Hero Wars as well, where they have those little puzzle ads inside the game, and that way they just like, you know, they work on improving the retention, making the game more interesting to users who come from those sources, and ultimately improve the ROAS and you know, the overall revenue of the game.
Yeah, and what you're also hinting at is how there's a seamless flow between an ad, the App Store, and the game itself. And you know, speaking of homescapes, this is something they also started to put into their App Store, iTunes, recently. I think it's somewhat recent, at least I noticed it recently. It's like, oh, we have new mini games where you can rescue Austin the Butler. You know, so that's certainly something that's a part of the ASO just as well. And so I could definitely see how making that fairly seamless can definitely impact your retention and longer term monetization as well.
Yeah, there's one more point that's important, I think, to bring up. It's also like UA often changes, or like what works on the UA front changes as the game gets older. as you know, usually when you start like running UA for a certain game, you tap into the like golden cohorts, and usually the performance is really good. But as you start spending more money and more aggressively, it's really hard to maintain the same kind of ROAS goals, which is why you also need to change the way you approach creative. You need to like go after slightly broader audiences, and that requires a different kind of both product and UA strategy. So I think in this particular case, in like homescapes and wildscapes, they simply kind of saturated all the core audiences that are interested in like match three, and now they're going after slightly broader audiences that are interested in puzzles and interested in just like games overall. And that's another example where, you know, like the game team and UA team need to work together, and the game team needs to understand that, you know, like the existing kind of wells of users, so places where you can find good users, are kind of drained, and that they need to like pivot and change the strategy.
Yeah, and they're also probably going after users who want the storyline of Austin or Lily, or you know, any of the other characters, right? So I think that becomes more critical, right?
Yeah.
And if you were to look at this dynamic from a product team's perspective, what are some of the ways in which it could be beneficial for a product team to understand market conditions and how UA works, and all of that?
Yeah. Yeah, I think you mentioned a good example about Lily and Austin. I think it could start from the very beginning. When you design the game or the product that you want to build and launch, you should think about these hooks or baits for like driving users to the game. So an example of like of Homescapes, it's a match-3 game, but it's also like a narrative-based game. There's like a narrative element, and you can use both of these elements to advertise, and you can tap into different audiences that way. And then on top of that, they added these like little puzzles. So I think when game teams start working on a new game, they need to understand what are the current market trends, what are the current creative trends, and whether like the gameplay they're trying to kind of build supports what are the gameplay they try to build combined with the theme they're using actually provides them with enough opportunity in the market where it can grow that game and turn it into like hopefully $100+ million game. So you kind of have to think about a mix of art style, theme, and gameplay that will yield you the highest possible amount of revenue. And in order for them to understand that, at least at a high level, the game team should understand, okay, what are the current trends? What are the current UA strategies that are working? So whether that's like Facebook AEO or VO, or like Google TCPA or like whatnot, and you know how, like for example, a rewarded video traffic performs, so like or like users who come from that channel perform in the game, and that it doesn't have to be like a very specific or very detailed understanding of the channels, but at least if you're building an IP heavy game, you should understand that the ways to drive payers in the game, the most dominant way of driving payers in the game are Facebook VO and AEO, and then make sure that the monetization in the game reflects that. And one way to do that is just like developing common language and just making sure that the product teams are familiar with the latest UA strategies or successful UA strategies.
Yeah, and I think at the simplest level, if they're at least familiar with what kind of ads the users see, they at least know that this is the kind of direction they could be building the game in, the kind of aesthetic they could be building. Right, and that makes a lot of sense. You know, and one of the challenges I have seen when it comes to this sort of collaboration is that the distinction between UA and product can be very real in many companies, partly because they roll up to different org structures. In fact, in one public company that I have some familiarity with, the UA teams sit on one floor, the product teams sit on another. So they're just part of completely different meetings other than one meeting per week where they just exchange notes and numbers, right? So that's why, you know, and so how, let's assume a company finds that they are in this form where they're so siloed that the teams just don't talk to each other. How do you envisage addressing this challenge and making sure there's more of a collaboration between what are essentially two very different org structures?
Yeah, one of the great things again about like there was some sort of epiphany for me when I joined N3twork was that we started working on goals together, like the game team and the UA team, and then the goal for this month would be, let's say we're going to spend $5 million or like $2 million, and the we would work with the game team. What would that mean in terms of like the revenue for that month? And we would start like working on just like predictions and figure out like, hey, figure out what the targets for daily targets are for that month, and then we would work together towards hitting that goal. I think that's quite crucial because games won't grow without UA, and UA teams won't be able to spend more money if games are not performing. So there's kind of like a virtuous cycle there. They can easily turn into a vicious cycle if like things start falling apart. So that's why the game teams need to consult with the UA teams and talk together and just understand, okay, how do we drive more users, and how do we what can we do to improve the UA performance? I think the crucial thing here is to develop common language, and in case of small teams, that's much easier, as you said, because pretty much like everybody sits in the same room, and the people on the game team can understand what the UA team is working on. In case of bigger teams, we talked a lot about the role of like product marketing manager and someone who's kind of like sits in between those two teams and bridges the gap. That's one solution. But when you think about it, if the game team wants to grow its revenue, revenue is, they need to understand where the new users are coming from and how the new users are affecting or impacting the revenue growth and revenue stacking. So if most of your revenue is coming from the users who are in their first 90 days of their lifetime, and if 90 days is the payback goal for the UA team, that basically means that you need a lot of new users in the game, and the UA team needs to hit their CPI. The RPI and CPI need to be like equal. It's like in the first 90 days, or basically the campaigns need to be profitable. If it turns out that users don't retain in the game after 90 days, that means that basically RPI won't grow, and that will mean that the UA team won't be able to spend more money. So there are like multiple ways to address that. You can either improve the monetization, which is not always easy, or you can lower the CPI, which is also not always easy. So the best way to solve this problem, if like both teams push and do their best to improve the monetization and lower the cost. Another thing another example that explains why it's important to develop common language is that, as you mentioned, like we talked about this before recording, like the game teams have different targets. They worry about DAU, monetizing DAU, like ARPDAU, etc. But the thing is, like, all of these metrics can vary quite a bit if like different UA strategies are deployed. So I still remember days when we would do like a tier 4 instant campaign where we're paying like half a cent for a user, 1 cent per user, and the retention drops, ARPDAU drops, everything looks like crap, and the game team just freaks out. But if the UA team does a good job explaining and giving a heads up to the team that something like that is going to happen, and what the impact on ARPDAU is going to be, the game team is going to be just fine. And as long as the revenue is growing, they'll be grateful, right? So that's an example where these two teams have to work together. So there's no scrambling on the game side to figure out what the hell is going on with ARPDAU, and at the same time there is no like need or pressure on the UA team to pause those campaigns, even though they're like a net positive for the company. We had those examples in the past. That's why these are very specific examples.
Yeah, and I actually worked on a game, and it's so important to have that common language and understanding, because eventually you're all shooting for the same goal, which is to grow the game, UA team and the game team. I actually had an experience a couple of years ago where the game was hugely profitable, but its LTV, according to a lot of the dashboards, was really bad. And they were like, oh, we're not going to invest money in this, but this is so hugely profitable. We have to invest money. We don't know how to do it. Right? So that was a conundrum. And eventually, I think the answer we figured out was, oh, there's just a lot of year 2 LTV and year 3 LTV. Let's just extend the payback window. And that will let us invest in it. And I think that took a lot of brainstorming to arrive at that point. But all of that to underscore what you said about how important it is to find common ground. And one of the challenges also tends to be that the infrastructure for UA and game teams is different. As UA managers, we're looking at cohorted numbers, and as game teams, they're not. They're just looking at overall numbers. So do you find there's a way of bridging the gap in the infrastructure, or should one team look at the other team's infrastructure? Because for whatever reason, there is no unified infrastructure or data stack that addresses the needs of both game teams and UA teams. How do you recommend thinking about this?
Yeah, so in our case, like the overlap is pretty high. And I'll mention the same example from earlier about like instant traffic and I don't know, specific traffic channels. The reason why the overlap needs to be high is because the game team still wants to know what's the ARPDAU for like a certain group of users that's behaving pretty consistently. That's why they need to understand like what's the contribution of paid users and organic users to the revenue and overall economy. What's for example, if they want to use if the team wants to use, I don't know, Facebook video users as kind of a group of users that's behaving consistently, they need to know that those are like Facebook video users. And at the same time, like the game team needs to understand how the game performs in different geos, on different platforms, and different OS versions, just to like know what type of decisions to make on the UA front. And for the UA team, it's really, really important to understand how the game performs from like the retention and revenue stacking standpoint. So if users, a lot of games that they work with, and now like I'm mostly focused working on the publishing side of things on the N3twork Scale Platform. It's like a lot of games have an issue where everything looks great in the first 30 days, but after 30 days, numbers just fall off the cliff, and that's usually because of like lack of content in the game, and or like poor long-term retention. So if people stop paying after 30 days, that means the revenue stacking is not occurring, and that means that you have to keep your payback windows really tight in order to keep your campaigns profitable, right? So that's why the UA team needs to understand like what's the retention profile of the game, how does the revenue stacking occur, and what it looks like. For example, does the cohort makes more money in the second month of their lifetime than in the first month? And based on that, what the LTV curve looks like. So, these two teams, and that's the reason why we work so closely with the game team, in order to understand, the behavior. And if you want to spend like a few $1 million a month on a certain game, and you don't understand what happens in month 2, month 3, month 4 in the game, then it's likely that at some point you'll just waste a lot of money, and you'll start, you'll get into that spiral of UA where you have to like scale things down. The game is not growing. People start pointing fingers at each other, but ultimately it's because there was not enough understanding on the UA side and the game side on how these two tactics or strategies best work together.
Yeah, definitely. And when we talk about this sort of collaboration, there are also teams that are adjacent to game teams and UA teams. Specifically, I'm thinking design and analytics. How do you recommend organizationally thinking about alignment between design teams that, let's just say UA design teams, UA analytics teams, game design teams, game analytics teams, right? So that's just 4 more sets of constituencies right there. How do you recommend thinking about them organizationally?
Yeah. So in our case, marketing analytics people are also part of a larger analytics group in the company. So they work together on making sure that, you know, the reporting is there. It's like in real time or near real time, and that, you know, both game team and like the UA team have like, you know, the best possible data set to work with, available data set. And they communicate quite often. And the goal is, again, to, you know, not to understand every single specific thing about UA, but to understand where, for example, a spend data is, where campaign data is, and how the game team can use that data to make the best possible decisions. So there should be, again, a pretty high overlap between marketing analytics and like overall analytics or like game analytics in the company. And these two functions should work closely together to just make sure that the teams have all the available levers in place to make the best possible decisions. In terms of design, like UA design and game design, one thing that we play around with a little bit is how can we, you know, like one thing we play around with is, because the game is event based and we have characters in the game, different characters in the game every week, can we like design characters in the game that are converting well on the UA front? And you know, in order to minimize the friction that we talked about earlier on. So can you improve the performance of your campaigns by finding specific topics and specific themes that work well on the UA front and have them in the game, and vice versa? So for example, we did some audience research 2 years ago, and we realized that, you know, people who play Legendary like heavy metal music and tattoos and cosplay, and then we were testing those themes on the UA front in order to see whether like the ROI is actually going to improve if we do that. So, you know, I think because of the kind of abundance of data that both teams have, there's like a lot of opportunities to work together and to inspire each other by just using what the other side knows. It's not always easy, and sometimes, you know, those two teams have different goals, but they can also unblock each other in times when they're not really aware of what the next step should be.
Exactly. I think there's definitely a lot of inspiration that artists can get from each other, just from looking at what's out in the market and what's happening in the game. Definitely, I think there's just a lot of opportunity. And, you know, with this sort of rich collaboration, what would you recommend? How would you recommend thinking about a meeting cadence, be it weekly or daily? What sort of a meeting cadence, and what might be some of the best practices that could make sense to ensure that this kind of collaboration is most fruitful?
Yeah. So for larger companies and teams, it might be smart to have product marketing managers, mainly because one of the shortcomings of this approach is that you're really looking to work with a unicorn who can understand both functions really well. And there's not that many people who can do both things. And that's why sometimes it's better to have a person who's basically in charge of making sure that the two teams are aligned and they're doing their best work. And in this case, there will be like a product marketing manager. When it comes to smaller teams, you know, it's much easier because everybody sits together and you know, people are more kind of like up to date on what's going on each front. And I think in terms of cadence and how often these 2 or 3 teams should, in case of product marketing manager, should work together, it depends a lot on the amount of spend and revenue as well. So if you're spending like a few $1 million a month, you kind of need to meet every day because there's more at stake. And, you know, when you're spending $200,000-$300,000 a day, you really have to know where the money is going and what's going on, because it's very, you know, mistakes can be quite costly, right? So in our case, you know, we would like meet every day, and there's still like someone from the UA team attending daily stand-ups of game teams every day, because we want to make sure that, you know, teams are aligned and are making the best decisions. In terms of some like when it comes to some earlier products that are in like soft launch and early development, you know, the cadence is not like as frequent, mainly because there is no need for that. But as the game starts scaling up and spending more money, and the UA team starts spending more money, there's definitely a need to meet more frequently.
Yeah, indeed. And really, I think a lot of this collaboration can put in place a virtuous cycle, you know, where the product team can help the UA team perform better, and the UA team can help the product team perform better. And indeed, that can help games grow very, very substantially, Again, that's something certainly you and your team at N3twork have definitely done just in the last couple of years. I've been very, very impressed just by the magnitude of what you guys have achieved. Nebo, I think that's perhaps a good place for us to start to wrap.
Yeah.
As we finish, can you tell our listeners how they can find out more about you?
Yeah, feel free to add me on LinkedIn. Just search for Nebo Network. It should be fairly easy to find me. I'm occasionally writing writing on Medium on my blog. So it's like medium.com/ENIAC or ENIAC. That's my online handle. And yeah, I'm fairly active on Twitter as well. But the best way probably to reach out to me is on LinkedIn, where I'm fairly active. And yeah, if you have any questions, if you want to learn more about how these two teams can work together and how to unlock growth opportunities, I'm always happy to talk to, industry friends. So just feel free to reach out.
Excellent. We will link to all of that in the show notes. Nebo, as always, this has been incredibly instructive. Thank you so much for being on the Mobile User Acquisition Show.
Thank you for inviting me. This was a great experience. So hopefully we'll do more in the future.
Absolutely.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Mobile User Acquisition Show. If any of this was helpful or instructive, I would love for you to leave us a review or rating on iTunes, Stitcher, Overcast, or wherever you get your podcast fix. This podcast takes a ton of time, effort, and love to produce, and I deeply value every review and every piece of feedback that you share. Thank you for listening, and I will look forward to sharing our next episode soon.